Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be just talking about this book here, Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks. And so I've obviously mentioned this in weekly wrap-ups and sort of gearing up for reading the Women's Prize, the shortlist as well. This is one of the last ones I read. And I just thought it was such an interesting book, and I really basically just wanted to talk about it a little bit more individually as well. Generally speaking, I'm going to be avoiding spoilers. I'll be announcing when spoilers are about to come, but most of this review should be relatively spoiler-free, just because I think I'm more interested in the way this book approaches the story than having to feeling like I have to go into tons of depth about the story itself, even though it's a very interesting and compelling story. So let's get started. So Fire Rush deals with particularly a fair few key themes, I guess, particularly around music and community and belonging, but equally around family, but also these sort of difficult choices that people have to make, often in sort of, if they're living in certain circumstances. And we meet our main character, Yamaye, early into the book as being this person who is strong and driven and powerful and ambitious and just has all this talent around music. But equally, this opening scene sort of shows her being both sort of lost in the music and really full of the energy of it, but also being in a situation where she's often kind of guarding her body and having to be quite vigilant around her. And so I find it really interesting the way this book deals with so many of these sort of key ideas, because the way this plot sort of moves forward and so much of the kind of key focus is around our main character Yamaye and really thinking back to previous friends and relationships. So she meets somebody called, I believe, Moose. Yes, called Moose fairly early on, who's this sort of really important figure in her life in many different ways. And as the plot goes on, she seems to have this sort of real understanding that things have fundamentally changed and she has to really reapproach certain parts of her life. But in the meantime, she's this incredibly strong figure, but she has a lot on her shoulders. She's constantly dealing with these sort of many sort of different things around her. And we know that she's strong enough as a character, and she's this strong person who's going to make it. But we also just get this sense of just the constant frustration of trying to build community and feeling that power and real resonance within a community, but then also that not always being enough, right? That she's got this real support around her, but sometimes she's dragged into horrible situations where there seemingly aren't that many options for her. And so I thought it was really interesting the way this book really approaches that for her, music is this sort of way of her navigating that world. And it takes place sort of across several locations, but particularly sort of place in London, or sort of just on the outskirts of London in one part, around Bristol and around Jamaica. 3 places known in many ways for music, or really, that have big, strong music cultures, but equally where so much of the relationships between those 3 places in this book are really interesting. That, she... so much of this book is told with this sort of Jamaican dialect and kind of is accented. And what I really appreciate about this book is it makes no bones about that. It's not sort of trying to say, oh, let me translate that for you. It just says things as characters would say them, and it's up to us as the readers to get on board and try and understand that. And I think there's something really powerful in that. There's something so unapologetic about the way it uses dialect. And not to say that you should ever be apologetic with dialect, but it's interesting that in some books there's a need, either from an editor potentially, or from the author, or from somebody else, to kind of pass what's being said and say, oh, by which I mean blah, 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 or put in brackets or as a footnote or whatever. And this book just tells this in this dialect. Characters talk the way they talk. And there's a real energy to the way that builds in this book, because not only is our main character Yamaye this sort of musician with this sort of like MC kind of skills, where that dialect and her accent and sort of slang and everything else comes out in what she's saying, but equally, like, that's the energy of this book as well. It has this sort of real rhythm and fire and power to it that carries so much in this book. And I think what I also found really interesting within that, thinking about the kind of the accent and the use of language and so many other things, is that this book is just, I think I found incredibly readable. I really just sort of raced through it. And I think a large part of that was that this book really brings you in to kind of follow its thought process. And so much of that thought process is around this idea of music bringing people together. You know, there are characters who have these sort of late night chats, or somebody says something and they think is a really interesting line. And so often those interesting lines are about this idea of music as this sort of unity, and music as this sort of magical life force that brings people together. And this book feels like such a celebration of that. And it's interesting because a book I read recently was Caleb Azuma Nelson's Small Worlds. And one of the things I said about that book, and particularly when in relation to this book, is just about how that book talks so much about its love of music. And music is this really central core part. And it was only as I was sort of flapping this book around earlier that I realized Caleb Azuma Nelson has written the little back blurb on this book, a sort of a little quote on the back of this book, talking about the joy of this book and how it talks about music. And so I think what I really love about this sort of book's approach to being a love letter to music is that that means that even when the character finds herself in some of the hardest situations imaginable, even when she's sort of at her lowest, and even when she is wondering if everything is worth it, music is this great savior and this great unifier for her. And that is something that is interesting at the back of this book. Not only the sort of the little author's part here, but also sort of some of the acknowledgements talk about how the author's own life is was also shaped a little bit by, for example, being involved in gangs, and now and how music was her route out. And so in some ways this, I mean, not to always draw a comparison between the author's life and the book itself, but this character of Yamaye has this real strength that comes through music. And there is such a love that I felt within this book from the writer of her character, that she, you know, she's allowed to be flawed, she's not perfect, all those other things. But there's something so striking about her as a main character that I just found really quite engaging. And I was sort of rooting for her, even though I had no real idea how this was all going to end up. So I think that's probably enough without going tons into spoilers or about the plot of this book. But I just think it's a really beautifully written and conceived book. And I just had a great time with it. I've heard that the audiobook is apparently really good as well, just for being being narrated as well with that dialect and with that rhythm that this book has. But this was a real unexpected one for me. I had no idea what to expect going into it. And knew very, very little about it, and came away really enjoying the whole ride. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it if you check it out, and take care, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye bye.